Welcome to 20-0 Tactics with me, the Loremaster, and on today's episode we're going to take a look at building competitive army lists. Now in fact this is going to be the start of a new series of videos, but I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that later on. So we're going to begin today's video by taking a look at how we're going to structure the episode. Firstly, I'm going to explain what we mean by the phrase competitive army list. Then we'll take a broad look at the different types of army lists you'll find, followed by a discussion on the common features of competitive army lists, before taking a look at two sample army lists to illustrate the principles we're discussing today. So what is a competitive army list? Well, in short, a competitive army list is one that has focused upon winning games of Warhammer first and foremost. Generally, a narrative theme or using units because you think they are cool would be put to one side in pursuit of getting the big W. So what we're saying in today's video is, these are our tips for building an army list that is going to give you the best chance to win in any given scenario or against any given opponent. So let's take a look at the different types of army lists that you're going to find in Warhammer. Well, in general there are 5 types of Warhammer army builds. Now this is by no means an exhaustive list, and some armies you face may feel like they fit into maybe more than one type of army from this list, but this generalisation will help us to group together armies kind of tactically and express how they work best. So the types of army builds are as follows. Multiple aggressive threat. Now these are armies that are typified by having several medium-sized threats, all of which carry similar levels of danger, and these armies will generally cover the tabletop very quickly. Defensive armies. Sometimes known as gun lines, defensive builds place emphasis on range damage with some counter-charge combat threats. Denial armies. These lists generally seek to prevent your opponent from gaining victory points as their kind of first and foremost tactic. Now in 8th edition you'll often find Death Star type units at the centres of these builds. Hammer and Anvil. These armies are typified by having blocks which are designed to hold things in place to grind down the foe, with flanking threats to smash into these pinned enemies for maximum damage. And finally we have multiple small units, or MSU. Now it is what it says on the tin. These armies generally have many low-cost, small units, and they'll go for as many as possible to damage enemies over time, whilst conceding few victory points for any units that are lost. Now, each of these army builds work very differently on the tabletop, and these descriptions give you kind of very little indication of the tactics involved in using them. But do not fear. Over the coming months, I'll be bringing you a video on the tactics for each of these army builds. Now, with that said, whilst each of these builds is very different, with different factions excelling in each one, for example, there are still elements that are common to all of them, and crucially, these elements are common to their success. So, in the next part of this video, we're going to look at the common elements, because whatever army list you build, some things should always be a forefront consideration. So, common features of competitive army lists. Once you've established the type of army list you want to build from the styles we just discussed, you need to think about the following things. Synergy. How do the elements of the army list interact? Armies where the characters or support units, for example, work well with the battle line shooting and flanking elements will always do better than a collection of raw power units. Putting items, spells and models together that improve other parts of the army list is a key principle in all competitive builds. Chaff. Such an important fundamental to any successful list. Building in points that can be lost in a manageable fashion, or that support the synergy of a list by killing enemy war machines, for example, will ensure you lose less points that you care about. If you sacrifice a 100 point unit of Dark Riders so that your 500 point unit of Witch Elves isn't flank charged, you're winning, and you have a chance to score more points later. Adding chaff to my army list was one of the biggest factors in improving its performance. It has a place in every list build. The ability to deal with a range of threats. Now, ensuring that your army list has the tools to deal with large, cheap battle line blocks, as well as, say, high toughness, high armour targets, for example, is crucial to constructing any army that is competitive against multiple opponents. It also helps you to be tactically flexible in each matchup as well. Points efficiency. When building, reviewing and analysing your list, you should ask yourself, do I need to spend those points? Just because you can upgrade something, or you have an allowance of items for a model, doesn't mean that you need to or should spend the points on those things. This is really helpful for getting in all those elements you want. It's also one of the trickiest parts of building a competitive army list. Missions. You need to consider any missions that your army might be playing when heading to an event. Ensuring that you have the elements for, say, Blood and Glory, if you know that you might have to play that mission, will allow your army to perform better across the event. Comp. This one only applies if the event uses a comp system, but you need to ensure that your list is comp legal, or if it's using a system like Triple Crown Wargaming comp, that it's got a reasonable score. Now, in general, for a tournament in our comp, the Triple Crown system, a list between kind of -5 and +5 will be capable of winning. But you need to make sure that you're looking at kind of specific bracketing and things like that if it's required. And just remember to ask yourself, can I afford to save this comp point? In fact, that question's really crucial. I'm just going to labour that point for a second. What I'm saying here is, could I afford to leave that at home? And sometimes the answer to that is, no, I can't afford to lose that. It's so important. And finally, meta. This one's a little bit tricky again, but you should try to think about sort of, how your list fits against lists that are being used at the moment that are sort of strong or common, if you like. Sometimes you might decide to go sort of hard against that structure in what people might know as sort of an anti-meta list. Other times you might seek to kind of sit in the structure, if you like. This is probably the least important common feature to consider, because if you've done the other 6 features well, your army will compete with whatever's put in front of it. But this is kind of tuning up your list slightly, if you like. So we've established our common features. Now all that's left to do is take a look at some sample army lists. So we're going to finish up today's video by looking at 2 competitive army lists. Both of these place very well in UK tournaments in 2021-22, and they are 2 different types of army as well, which will help to illustrate the common features of competitive builds. Now we're going to go through the list's contents. They'll be on your screen throughout this section, and then we're going to look at how they deliver on the kind of common features that we outlined above. So first up, we have an Empire army list. Now this one came first at the North Remembers 2022 event. Now the event used a version of the Triple Crown Wargaming comp, and the list came in at a -1 overall. And I would describe this list as a classic hammer and anvil. So the list consisted of an Archlector with the White Cloak of Auric, the Charmed Shield, the Fencer's Blades, heavy armour, and mounted on a War Altar of Sigmar. It had a Battle Wizard Lord, level 4, on the Law of Light, with the Van Horstman's Speculum, the Opal Amulet, and the Power Stone. It had a level 1 Battle Wizard on the Law of Light with a Dispel Scroll. It had another level 1 Battle Wizard on the Law of Light with no upgrades. The Captain of the Empire, who was the Battle Standard Bearer. He had the Dragon Helm, the Luck Stone, the Sword of Might, and full plate armour. And it had a Witch Hunter with a brace of pistols. For core, it had 40 halberdiers with full command and shields. They had 2 detachments, 5 archers in one and 6 archers in the other. And to round out the core, we had 12 Knights of the Inner Circle with full command and the Steel Standard. Into special, we had 37 great swords with a musician and a standard bearer, so no champion. We had 4 Demigryph Knights with a musician, another 4 Demigryph Knights with a musician. Finally, into rare, we had a Celestial Hurricanum and a Steam Tank. So now let's consider our common features of competitive army list. So let's start with synergy. Now, if you're at the event or if you've seen this type of list before, you will know how well this army delivers on synergy. There is bucket loads in here, guys. So we have a Light Council, the 3 battle wizards, all on the Law of Light, which improves the strength of banishment if they have it. Now, alongside the War Altar of Sigmar, which has a bound spell version of banishment, which also gets the strength buff from those wizards, you've got a set of characters there that do a huge amount of support for each other. But it goes a lot further than that. The War Altar offers hatred to units within 6 inches. Now, it doesn't apply to mounts, but it does apply to riders. But you'll notice in this list we had a block of 40 halberdiers and a block of 37 greatswords, which spent their entire time hanging out with the War Altar of Sigmar. This allowed them to have hatred in the first round of combat basically every time, which was amazing. Behind them we popped our Celestial Hurricanum, which gave them +1 to hit, so we're getting additional to hits, we're really rolling to hits. And we look back at the Law of Light and we've got the ability to improve their weapon skill as well, and their initiative to mean they'll go first. They've got Always Strikes First as an option in that law as well. So you can see a huge amount of synergy there alone. Now the hammer elements to this list, the Steam Tank, the Demigryph Knights, the Inner Circle Knights, build a synergy in with themselves because you've got 2 blocks there that are hard to break, which then get supported by the hammers coming in the flanks. So, and honestly, the synergy goes even further than that. The light magic and altars high strength banishment combines well with the Steam Tank to offer 3 really potent high strength damage output elements in the Steam Tank's cannon. The unbreakable element of the Steam Tank can be used to double it up as another anvil to hold something in place to help us support later. The White Cloak gives -1 to hit on the Arch Lector, which can be synergised with fast protection from the Law of Light for -2 to hit. The list goes on and on. I mean, even the Witch Hunter having magic resistance too and dropping him into the greatswords is amazing. So, synergy wise, this list delivers punch. So chaff. This list delivers a little light on chaff actually. We've got the 2 detachments of archers. Now, Empire aren't renowned for their chaff game, but we do have them in there. And actually, the Witch Hunter and the level 1 Battle Wizard with no Dispel Scroll are very low points. 55 for the Witch Hunter, 60 for the Battle Wizard. So actually they double up as chaff options in the late game as well. Meaning that it looks very light on chaff, but actually is maybe a little deceptive there. It's got chaff options. Now, it doesn't have a lot of anti-War Machine chaff. The chaff it's got is very much for sacrificing for battlefield advantage. But that's okay, because that's supplemented by the long-range damage from the spells and the cannon on the Steam Tank. So let's look at the ability to deal with a range of threats. Well, this army list has that in spades. It's what makes it successful. You have the Great Swords having strength 5, and the Demigryphs having strength 5 armor piercing, and the Knights of the Inner Circle being strength 6, all of which give you really good anti-armor and anti-elite options. Speaking of elite things like high toughness, the banishments and the cannons coming in from the Steam Tank and the wizards offer support there. The ability to tackle enemy characters is supported by the Van Horstman's Speculum on Battle Wizard Lord. It's also supported by the Witch Hunter, who can use the interaction with Law of Light to let him go first to killing blow an enemy character of his choice, which come up a little more often than you'd expect. So how does it deal with big enemy units? Well, I mean, it's got fantastic armor save on those Demigryphs, which can simply go into big cheap blocks and grind them to death as long as they don't lose on combat res, which is unlikely with the amount of output they have, particularly in the list with the synergy with Law of Light. Similarly, your blocks can go toe-to-toe with large enemy blocks. So even elite blocks like White Lions and Executioners have to be really careful of those great swords with the buffs that this list puts on them. So in a very real sense, this covers a lot of threats. So it does have to consider really sustained high toughness across an army like Wall of Nurgle. That's probably its biggest drawback, but we've worked really hard to really cover lone single threats, blocks of cheap infantry, blocks of elite infantry, and well-armoured foes, which is a good spread for any army list to be able to cover. So, points efficiency. Now, this list has got some pretty cutthroat decisions on points efficiency. You'll notice that we've gone for an Opal Amulet on the Battle Wizard Lord rather than a full 4+ ward save in the Talisman of Preservation, and that's really deliberate. It's to shave the points off. You'll notice that we've not quite spent every point on the Arch Lector, spending 90, I think, of his allowance rather than 100. You'll also notice we've got 2 characters with no upgrades at all. Now, we have bought shields for the Halberdiers. I had to make 625 points a core there, so they would be a cut normally, but I didn't have any other way to make those 40 missing points. You'll notice with the great swords, we've chopped the champion. It's a shame to lose that attack, but we needed to find a few points to get musicians on both the Demigryph Knights units, which, thanks to Swift Reforming, is so important. We had to make a cut somewhere, and we could get away with it there because we know we're going to have a captain and a witch hunter in that unit at least, who can kind of do some of that function too. So I think we've been very points efficient with this list. Missions. Now, we had to consider seriously the missions that were present at the North Remembers when I built this list. One of those involved a challenge mechanic where you picked a Lord level character at the start of one of the games, and you'd have to fight it off with an enemy chosen Lord level character. Something that Empire struggle with unless you've got maybe a Templar with a Rune Fang. It's a risky one. So you'll notice I put the Van Horstman Speculum in my list, and that was very purposeful so that when that mission came up I could pop him in to that challenge to ensure that he came away with a great result for me in stealing the enemy stats and giving me the best chance of winning that fight. Other missions that were included in this event were banner based or fortitude based, so you'll notice that I've got a reasonable spread. I've got a stubborn unit of great swords with banner, and my BSB would go in there, so it's 2 stubborn fortitude points. My Arch Lector's a point, bit of a risk, but he has got a ward save, he has got a charm shield to help preserve that point, and he is -1 to hit if you get him in combat. So we've done our best with missions there as well. Comp wise, I didn't get too bent out of shape on comp for this one. This is a 3,000 point army list, it's worth saying, and it can be a bit easier to soften your comp score at 3k for a lot of armies, and hence mine being a -1. I put the Witch Hunter in as really the only concession to comp. I would have took the Great Swords regardless, and to be honest, I think the balance was what was crucial for me here. The other points were so important that I wasn't as concerned about comp. As it is, it came out reasonable. I could have gone for a plus score and dropped my Dispel Scroll, but I really think that you miss it. So I think I asked myself, can I afford to save this comp point? And I couldn't, so I kept it. And meta was a consideration for this list, actually. The thing I considered was the fact that the composition that was used was a version of our comp, but it was much, much harder on Nurgle Demons. And so it made me feel more confident in using this list, knowing that its weakness was fighting an army that had really high toughness and a decent save across the board, like Nurgle Demons with a ward save and good toughness. I knew it was unlikely I was going to fight them, so I could allay some of that concern for myself. So you'll see this Hammer and Anvil list hits all of the points that we discussed. So let's move on to our second list analysis now. And we're going to take a look at the Vampire Count's army list that came third at Cardiff Crusade 2021. Now again, this event used a version of the Triple Crown Wargaming comp we're getting everywhere, along with 50% Lords and Heroes allowance this time. The list came in at a -2 overall, and is a standard multiple aggressive threat list. So we start with the Vampire Lord. He was a general, he had heavy armour, was using the Law of Vampires, was a level 1 wizard. Had Quick Blood, Red Fury, a shield, the Dragon Helm, the Ogre Blade, and the Talisman of Preservation. I also had a Master Necromancer, using the Law of Vampires. He was a level 4 wizard, with a Dispel Scroll and a Dragonbane gem. We had a Calm Wraith hero for 60 points. You love to see it. In the core slot, we had 16 Crypt Ghouls, with a champion. We had 2 units of 5 Direwolves, 40 skeletons with full command and the banner of swiftness. We had 40 zombies with a musician and a standard. Into the special slot, I had 2 bat swarms in 2 units of 2, so the 4 bat swarms in total, but 2 units of 2. I had 7 crypt horrors, 5 hex wraiths, and then into the rare slot we had Terrorgeist, and Vargulf. Now this was a 2,500 point army list. So once again, we're going to go back to our common features list and see how this list delivers on the common features. So let's start with synergy. Okie dokie. So what a synergy list has. So ultimately, the first thing we have to look at when we play any Vampire's army is keeping things in range of the general. Okay? And that's the Vampire Lord. And my one was on foot, so you'll notice the first nod to synergy is Banner of Swiftness in my skeleton block, and my Vampire went in there to ensure that it was a little bit faster and could keep my army moving well. Now, synergetically, I've got 2 Law of Vampires casters. This is really important because we want to make sure that we get the magical move spell. This army is a typical MAT, or multiple aggressive threat, in that it likes to move quickly to get around you and do damage, and this does that so well because it's likely with 5 throws of the dice on the Law of Vampires to get the magical move spell that does this. Beyond that, the synergy really centres around 2 Terrorgeists and what they do. Now, Terrorgeist screams work by rolling 2d6, adding the remaining wound to the Terrorgeist. They start at 6. Incidentally, strong synergy there with the 2 Vampires casters. The Law attribute gives wounds back to the Terrorgeist if they're within range. Very strong. And then this is compared to the leadership value of the enemy, and you take wounds with no armour saves equal to the difference. Really strong. Now, this can be shot at units that are engaged in combat as well. So you'll notice that we've got big unit of zombies, big unit of skeletons, and a chunky unit of Cryptorers, 21 regenerating toughness 5 wounds. Now, these units are all here to pin that down and allow the Terrorgeist to scream in. So in a way, you see a little bit of overlap with a Hammer and Anvil style there as well. As said earlier, sometimes list styles overlap. So that's a crucial element to the synergy. We also have Hex Wraiths that can do a similar role because they're ethereal, and the same with the Calm Wraith. If the unit doesn't have a lot of static combat res, they can be used to pin and allow the Geists to scream off as well. There's more synergy to come with that Van How's Dance Macabre as well, and the Hex Wraiths, which ensuring you've got both there. The Book of Arcan is the one thing I really wish I had in this list in addition, which guarantees me another Van How's, and that allows you to move the Hex Wraiths. The Hex Wraiths do damage by moving through enemies, so having another move, another chance to do damage, you get the picture. There's more synergy as well with the Bat Swarms. These give the enemy always strikes last, so we like to put these into combat with the Cryptorers in particular that are low initiative. It also works really nicely with the Skeletons and the Vampire Lord's Quick Blood in particular there, where you can strip the enemies always strikes first so that you get rerolls and they don't. So, you know, again, a reasonable nod to synergy here. So let's take a look at our second point, chaff. Vampire counts excel at chaff drops. They are so good at it. I cannot stress this enough. This list is packed with chaff, and it was really a crucial element to the army list's success. The 2 units of direwolves obviously are sacrificial chaff, although they do have vanguards, so they're very good actually, and movement 9 at charging into enemy war machines early doors to help protect the Terrorgeists. The Hex Wraiths do the same and can double up as chaff in the late game, although slightly expensive, and the Bat Swarms are excellent chaff as well as being excellent support. Plus, the Necromancer can raise chaff, and the Calm Wraith can shoot out of units to act in a chaff role. He is particularly strong like that for assassinating enemy characters if they don't have a magic weapon, because he can do the Chill Grasp or swing with 3 strength 5 attacks. He's very versatile in that role. He also makes a unit called Terror, which is generally my skeletons, which is just nice because this list has got Vargulf that causes terror, 2 Terrorgeists that cause terror, Hex Wraiths that cause terror, and then the skeleton block thanks to the Calm Wraith that causes terror. So 5 terror causing drops. Really horrible to keep making your opponent take terror checks. So let's think about the ability to deal with a range of threats. So this army does not struggle with high toughness or high armour thanks to the Terrorgeists and the Hex Wraiths. And it doesn't really struggle with massive blocks of cheap enemies either, because the Vampire Lord can dish out a whale of casualties on any level of opponent with his Red Fury, Quick Blood and Strength 7 combination. The Varghulf is also excellent. On 2 of my games, the Varghulf basically charged into sort of low strength blocks, one being a big unit of Dark Elf Spearmen on his own, and just wrecked the whole unit, killed them all over 3 turns. And he did the same for me in another game as well, against some Corsairs, some Dark Elf Corsairs. So again, I played Dark Elves twice. He was excellent in both those matchups. The Crypt Horrors are also brilliant at killing monsters because they have poisoned attacks and are tough. They're really good at killing blocks of cheap enemy units. In fact, if it's not very well armoured, they'll kill it for you. It's got reach because of the sort of the Terrorgeists and the Wraiths. It's good. It's good. It can deal with a lot. Has to watch out for Bane of the World Dragon, but it deals with that with the chaff, blocking it up and using the list to kill the stuff around it. So yeah, definitely capable of punching through different types of threat. So let's look at points efficiency. Well, you'll notice I'm character light, and that's a real nod to points efficiency because do I have to have a BSB? No, I can live without it. Do I need, vampire heroes? No, they're not very good for their points. So I've split my Master Necromancer and my Vampire. I know some of you might think, well, make the Vampire 110 points dearer and save yourself the points on the Master Necro, make him level 4, but I think that's worth considering. That I actually think you're kind of getting more out of the points by letting the Vampire blend without the risk of losing him to miscasts, and letting the Master Necromancer kind of focus on his thing. Again, you'll notice no ward save on that Necromancer. He's going to hide behind my army and that small unit of ghouls. Doesn't need one. He restores lost wounds if he needs to on himself from his Law of Magic. He doesn't need one. So I'm not going to waste the points on it. Going to be brutal. Again, the Crypt Horrors, 7 is enough. Don't need the 8th one. Looks pretty on the tray, but don't need it. Don't want to pay the comp for it either. Second point. Didn't take champions on the Hexwaves, the Terrorgeists. The Crypt Horrors, the Hexwaves. Didn't take the upgrades on the Terrorgeist. These are not things that offer you a great improvement in points. So we didn't take them. So missions. Now Cardiff did have quite a few different missions. It had some other things to consider as well. One of the big considerations with their rules changes was that they made hills infinity high, and every table had a hill in the middle of it. So I knew that I could hide my Terrorgeists from artillery very easily at Cardiff Crusade, and that worked out very strongly for me. Taking the high ground was one of the missions, and it needed to be done with fortitude, which is why I had the skeletons with the banner to get them on the hill faster, and the general in there to do lots of damage with his Calm Wraith buddy, and that was very efficient for me. They also had a mission where things started off the table. That's really tough for vampires, and there's not a lot you can do about that. But you will notice that I had 2 units that fly, 1 unit in the Varghulf that marches on its own, and I had kind of vanguarding and fast cavalry units. So when I did set up in random places, it allowed me to get back into position quicker, which is really important. I did originally want Flying Horror on the Vampire for that as well, but I just couldn't squeeze it in the points efficiency thing again. Comp. Now this one did apply quite clearly here. The Bat Swarms were deliberately chosen as chaff in this list to change the comp score. I felt that seeing how the comp was slightly different at this event, there were certain armies that I thought were going to do well because the comp had been made a lot softer on them, and those armies did perform. The winning army had a big comp reduction and some comp changes, and I felt that was going to be an issue, and that my comp needed to be closer to 0 than the traditional kind of -4 I'd normally run with this type of army. So I put the Bat Swarms in. It meant that I didn't have another unit of Hex Wraiths, which is a painful loss. It also meant that I couldn't experiment with other characters as well, perhaps a Banshee or things like that. But again, you have to suck that up and look at that sometimes. And I asked myself, can I afford to lose these things for comp points? And the answer was, yeah, I needed those comp points, so I took them. And meta, that's the final one of our points. So how did this cover on meta? Well, the truth is I didn't really know what to expect hugely at this event. I knew that there'd be 50% Lords and Heroes, so I expected people to have invested more heavily in characters. So I ensured that my Vampire Lord was as teethy as ever, but I would do that anyway if I'm being honest. But I chose not to do that for that reason. I chose to be anti-meta, not to fit into the idea that people of joining the group that were going to bring lots of characters. I thought I'll go character light, which allowed me to have more multiple aggressive threats. When we talk about that in the multiple aggressive threat video, you'll see me talking about how you can kind of shift threat from characters to blocks, and what that means in a kind of mat list, if you like. But crucially, I had both the Terrorgeists, the Hexwraiths, the Varghulfs, knowing that they could deal with characters as well, and that my enemy would likely have a lot of them. So, and that gamble paid off for me. I think everyone but one of my opponents had invested, heavily in characters. They'd breached the kind of character bracket quite a lot. I know I went slightly over the 625. I think I was 630 in Lords, 634. But only 10 points, and where I've sacrificed the heroes, I had a very low character point spend versus opposition I played, and that played out really well for me in this list. So you'll see both these lists, very different that they are. One that's sort of a bit more kind of trading on the middle, one that chases the enemy down further. Both of them look really sharp on the common features, and you'll see when we talk through the videos we're going to make for you on the 5 different army types, how we keep coming back to the common features and seeing how they apply as well. It's really important to understand that these features will ensure your army list is stronger. And that's it. So to summarise, if you remember to stick to the common features we've just discussed and pick a clear style for your army, you'll be well on your way to turning out a more competitive build for your games of Warhammer. Now make sure you check out the other 20 Tactics videos on each of the army styles to get more sort of in-depth understanding of their tactics and play style. Now these will be coming across the closing months of 2022. Now that concludes today's episode of 20 Tactics. I hope it's given you some ideas for your next army list. As ever, feel free to get in touch through all of our social media platforms to let us know what you think, and head back to the Night of the Realm mustering ground to check out the rest of our exclusive content.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright?